Hello, everybody on the other side of my screen. And thanks, Mark, for the introduction. And through you, thanks to the NAS for having invited me to this wonderful event, which is bringing together people from so many different parts of the world. I thought it would be useful to provide some geographical context for the story or stories that I'm going to share with you today. And it is what you see in the screen. It's the southernmost part of the Americas, and more specifically, a region called Patagonia. In the map, you can see the location of Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. So Patagonia is actually a region that is shared by Chile and Argentina. And it is a region that has had, let's say, geopolitical significance in historic times, precisely because of its location. You can see it's quite strategically located to provide control in the connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And it is precisely in that context that the archipelago that I've just let's say marked in the map, which is known as Malvinas in Spanish, Falkland in English, and Malouine in French, was disputed by three maritime powers at the 18th century, those being, of course, Spain, Great Britain, and France. So it is in this historic context that by 1769, there was a small fleet from Great Britain that was posted at the base that Great Britain had in those islands. The base is Port Egmont. And one of the ships was HMS Swift, which looked like the scale model you see in the image, pretty much. It was a sloop of war, a sixth-rate warship. And at that time, when the maritime powers were not engaged in fighting against each other, they took advantage of the, let's say, the breaks between the fights to conduct geographical expeditions and to do some mapping, to explore the shores, and so on. So that's what happened in early March 1770, when the captain of HMS Swift, George Farmer, decided to set sail on one of these, let's say, geographic exploration trips. And the problem was, there were 91 men on board the Swift. The problem was that after a few days of very bad weather, they became very far away from, they ended up being very far away from the archipelago. They were right next to the continental coast. And some of the officers on board the Swift had been in that area before in previous trips. And one of them suggested that they entered an estuary called Deseado Estuary, which was known as a sheltered place, a good anchoring place. So the plan was that they could rest there, recover from the many days of really bad weather, and then continue with whatever they were going to do. But they had very bad luck, because when they entered the estuary, they hit two rocks. First one, the rocks were concealed by the high tide. So of course they couldn't see them. And they hit one rock, then they hit the second rock. And after hitting the second rock, the ship got stranded. And then when the tide began to come down, to ebb, the ship was lost. Thankfully, most people survived. They could reach the land, except for 3 men who died in the accident. So here's another view of the Deseado Estuary. This is looking from west to east. You can see, let's say in the top part of the image, the Atlantic Ocean. And in the oval on the left is the rock that here can be seen with low tide, where the Swift was lost. So how did this event, sorry, I want to say something before carrying on with what I was about to do, which is that the end of the story for the shipwrecked people. They reached land. They were there in the middle of nowhere, not knowing what to do, because people back in Port Egmont didn't know where they were, and so they evaluated options of how to get out of the place, having lost their ship. And one option that they thought about was walking to Buenos Aires to ask for help. That is 2,000 kilometers, for you to have an idea, and crossing major rivers on the way. And plan B, which to me sounds equally suicidal, was to row back to Port Egmont to ask for help there. And that's what they did. We're talking about 370 nautical miles in the open South Atlantic. They did that, they succeeded, they asked for help. So about a month after the accident, all the HMS Swift survivors were rescued by another ship of that small fleet and went back to the islands, and then eventually back to England. Okay, so how does this story become an archaeological project? It's what you can see on the screen. It's this document, which are the memoirs of one of the ship's officers, Lieutenant Erasmus Gower, who of course is the man depicted on the left. He wrote his memoirs, and that included, with quite a lot of detail, the loss of the Swift and events prior and after that. And that diary was something that a descendant of his came across with. Is this man. He passed away a few years ago, sadly. He was an Australian citizen, and he was a descendant of Erasmus Gower. He was called Patrick Gower. And when Patrick read about the story of the Swift, he thought it would be great to come to Argentina and find out more about the ship where his ancestor was on board back in 1770. So Patrick starts another adventure, which is to come to Argentina. This was 1975, imagine, prior to the communications we have today, prior to Google, to WhatsApp, to Skype and all of that. And he came first to Buenos Aires, then to Puerto Deseado. By the way, he didn't speak Spanish, and he came on his own. And finally, he arrives to Puerto Deseado, and to his surprise and to his disappointment for sure, nobody in the town had any idea that there was a sunken ship right there in front of their nose. And what happened was the opposite of what Patrick expected. Instead of him finding out more about HMS Swift, he ended up leaving a copy of this diary by Erasmus, and people in Puerto Deseado realized that they have a sunken ship in the estuary, not knowing exactly where, but in the estuary. So what happens next? A group of very young divers, in fact, one of them was only 16 years old at the time, decided to start searching for the Swift. There are several remarkable things in this component of the story. One was how difficult it was to dive at the time. And why do I say that? Not only because they wore, of course, those what we call rubber dive suits that do not protect very well from the cold temperature. By the way, the water temperature in the estuary is about 8-9 degrees centigrade. But they had to travel 300 kilometers just to fill up their diving cylinders, because in Puerto Deseado there was no infrastructure for diving. So they had to go to a city called Comodoro Rivadavia to fill in the cylinders. So it was 600 kilometers round trip just to dive for maybe half an hour. So it is amazing that these young men did that. But of course, they were passionate about the idea of finding the ship. And another remarkable thing, which I always want to mention, is that they agreed that if they found the ship, they would not keep the artifacts for themselves, nor sell them. They agreed that whatever they found was going to be part of their little town's public heritage. And that's what has been up to date. So in March 1982, they finally discovered the site. And you can see some newspaper clips of the time when it says, where it says important discovery of 2 young men from Deseado and so on. So a few years have had to pass until our team, which is called PROAS for the acronym in Spanish, Programa de Arqueología Subacuática, or Underwater Archaeology Program of the National Institute of Anthropology, became involved. And why and how did this happen? These people from Puerto Deseado had amazing good intentions, as I just said, but the problem was that the artifacts were not conserved properly. So they took them out of the site straight to a museum, which, by the way, was purposefully built to host the entire collection of the Swift. But like I said, there was no conservation. Another thing that I want to mention before moving on is that not only a museum was built in the town to host the collection, but the site was declared historical heritage. And that was the first legal precedent for the protection of underwater archaeological remains. At the time, 1982, 1983, there was legislation protecting archaeological elements on land, but not underwater. So that is also amazing. Anyway, back to 1995, we were called because they wanted a team of archaeologists who could do a systematic work and start doing research. And that was our team, which was just formed because some of us, like myself, had to learn to dive in order to start working on the Swift. So we set some research questions to begin with. So one was, did the artifacts reflect social hierarchies on board? What was the technology like, considering the period, second half of the 18th century? What did people eat on board? We expected to find some food remains because of the cold water and the anaerobic conditions. How was the ship constructed? And what natural and cultural processes affected the archaeological site? So with those questions in mind, we started working on the Swift. This was 1997 or 8. And we started by drawing a general site plan to start getting acquainted with the remains and what they look like. By the way, the bow is on the right side of the image. And in the stern, you can see indicated in red the area where we started excavating. This, of course, is an area that at the time was occupied by the officers on board. So we expected that area could provide information about one of our research questions, which was the social hierarchies on board. And this is a drawing that illustrates how we work. We normally use drawings because the visibility in the site is quite low. It's about 1.5 meters, with luck 2 meters. So you can never have a picture, for example, that shows as much as this drawing show. But this is to give you an idea of the excavation in the stern. What you can see there are the 8 square meters with which we started excavating. And you can see that one of the divers is holding the mouth of a dredge. It is a water dredge. And then you have the other elements that are typically used in this type of work. And you can see also the location of the mizzenmast and part of the main deck. The ship is listed towards the port side. And these are a few photographs of the underwater work. In the top one, you can see what remains of the mizzenmast precisely. And then other images like this one, for example, where we are excavating a piece of furniture. The image on the left shows like a cupboard that of course was collapsed, but which had shelves on top of which there were porcelain bowls, cups, and things of the sort. And on the right, there's the recording in detail, of course, of the context of everything that is being found. As you well know, it's important to record everything in situ before extraction. So that takes a lot of time. But throughout the years, we ended up excavating the areas that you can see indicated on the slide. The excavation entered into an impasse in 2010, but we consider we have a good enough sample of archaeological materials and, of course, information about what happened in relation to this site. That is our working platform on the left, the pontoon, and you can see how now the estuary has become an active harbor. In fact, there's even a dry dock close to the site, so there's a significant amount of traffic of ships there. It's not the ideal place to be working, but it is what it is. And on the right, you can see us bringing up some artifacts in the usual relatively small baskets in which we put a few artifacts, of course, each of them with corresponding label in the bag, like Ziploc type bags. And then we take them to the museum, which is the place where we work. So back in the museum, we do the usual, we record. We have like a logbook on diving and archaeological data that is filled up every day. We do some drawings and photographs of the artifacts. And also I shouldn't say we, normally the architect who draws very, very well, of course, like most architects do, makes very tidy drawings of each archaeological layer. And in this image, you can see some of the artifacts in their context. You can see that there are a lot of elements in this just 1 square meter. So it's a busy site from that point of view. You can see a plate, you can see a spigot, a candle holder, and a cutlery handle. And here you can see window panes, a demijohn type of bottle, big one, and a compartmented box contained so-called gin bottles, square bottles, that could have gin inside. That was the most common alcoholic drink they carried, but you never know, because sometimes the bottles are reused and they can have something else. In this case, there was a gas chromatography analysis conducted with the liquid contained in one of them, because as you can see, this one, for example, had a stopper in place, and it was confirmed that it was an alcoholic beverage, but it wasn't possible to identify which one. And here, I think it's the last one of this series. You can see some more artifacts like a tumbler, some porcelain bowls and plates. And I don't expect you to read the numbers, but what I want to point out is that the arrows are pointing at the relative depths of each of the elements. So like I said, it's layer after layer that we are recording in order to not to lose that precious information of context. So how do we integrate this into the research questions? Because you can have as much tidy and detailed recording of artifacts, but you have to remember what's the ultimate goal, which is to learn, to make some progress in knowledge. So here I'm going to share with you some of the results. And if you remember, one of our original research questions was whether the artifacts reflected social hierarchies on board. And here you can see these elements all come from the excavation in the stern, that the officers had good, let's say, good quality artifacts in general. This image is showing Chinese porcelain and English pottery, and you can see there's quite a variety of types. There's also good quality for the officers in terms of metal objects like buckles and cutlery. The buckles are made of silver, the one on the right, brass, the one on the, silver, the one on the left, brass, the one on the right. The spoons, there's a silver spoon on the left and a pewter spoon on the right, but that pewter spoon was made by a prominent pewter smith of the time. So it was still a good quality item. Then regarding food or diet on board, we found some very interesting elements. One pretty outstanding one was remains of penguin eggs. And this makes perfect sense, because why wouldn't you take advantage of local resources that can complement what the Admiralty gave for the crew to take on board? And of course, both the Malvinas Islands and all over Patagonia and certainly Antarctica are regions where penguins breed, reproduce. So eggs are easy to collect. And like I said, it's quite interesting, I think, that we found remains of penguin eggs on the site. And we also found several seeds and grains, such as mustard, pepper, squash, nutmeg, and grape in the form of raisins. This is also interesting because it shows that the diet, maybe at least for some, because we don't know if everybody had access to this, was not as restricted or as dull as one would think if you are only based on the how to say, on the historical documents, on the official documents. Then regarding technology, for example, with glass, we find artifacts that are characteristic of the 18th century, like these bottles, tumbler, and stemware, but the quality is variable. Some elements are quite coarse, like what you can see on the left, and others are made with, let's say, better manufacture quality, like the stopper on the right. And continuing with the technology of the time, this illustrates some metal artifacts. that are interesting, particularly the coins, because the coins at the time, by the way, you can see that originally they looked like those discs with no relief on the surface, but after cleaning them in the center, you can see what they actually looked like. But the interesting thing is the composition, because they had to be made of pure copper, but some were made of an alloy that did not respect the 100% copper that they should have. And not only that, they were molded. So they were made by mold rather than struck, as it should have been the case. So what's the conclusion? They were counterfeit. So that's quite interesting. And then the image on the right shows evidence of repair of a metal artifact, in this case, a candle holder. Okay, but there were some other research topics that we did not expect to deal with, but were triggered by some finds. In this case, the research topic is health, and it was started by the finding of a wooden chest that looked like a medicine chest, and it had a fantastic collection of containers, like you can see in the photograph. And some chemical analysis has already been conducted with some of them, and we found that two of them contained mercury in different forms, one in the form of mercurous chloride, another one pure mercury. And at the time, mercury was considered to be good for treating venereal diseases. But of course, it wasn't, not only it wasn't good for treating venereal diseases, but as you probably know, it could cause severe neurological damage. But other finds are interesting, such as the anthraquinone, which is an element that has a multi-purpose function. It's of course of botanical origin, but it can be used to treat the onset of gangrene, to treat gum diseases. It can be used as like a sunscreen for the tropics. So I think we're learning quite a lot about this little medicine chest. But the most unexpected find we had were human remains. Like I told you at the beginning, only 3 men had died when the Swift was lost. So we never ever expected to find human remains. But in the summer of 2005, 2006, we found a complete skeleton, and it was in very good preservation condition, and it was also associated with some elements related to the clothing the person was wearing at the time, like the buttons and buckles, like you can see on the right-hand side. And so far, we've learned quite a lot about this person. He was a young adult male, approximately 25 years of age, 1.67 meters in height, probably right-handed, with good bone and dental health. And this is the most interesting thing. There were some traces of cloth attached to the bones, to the scapula bones, the shoulder bones. And that cloth turned out to be wool. And that wool turned out to be dyed with a dye from a plant called madder. And interestingly, according to the Admiralty instructions, the jackets of the soldiers of the time had to be dyed in red with that product coming from that plant. So we know that when this person died, he was wearing a red woolen jacket. So he had to be wearing a military uniform. So he was a Marine. So we know that he has to be one of the 2 Marines who died, Robert Rusker or John Ballard. Sadly, we don't know who this person was exactly, whether he was John Ballard or Robert Rusker. And the problem is that mitochondrial DNA was extracted, so we have DNA from the skeleton, but there are problems. First, there are many generations in 1770 to trace down descendants. The transmission of mitochondrial DNA is through the women in the family, so the surnames tend to be lost with marriages along the generations. It is even possible that neither Ballard nor Rusker had descendants, and those descendants, of course, had to be women. So it's really complicated. I don't lose hope that someday we will be able to find out who this person actually was. For now, the person is buried in the British cemetery in Buenos Aires, which is actually a sector of a very big cemetery called Chacarita Cemetery. And these are images of the amazing ceremony that took place at the time, where representatives from the Argentine Navy and the British Navy got together for this event with extreme respect. The religious ceremony was held in Spanish and in English. And it was really moving, as you can imagine. And it shows that despite the controversies that our two countries have, mainly over the Falkland Malvinas archipelago, things like this can happen, and it's very rewarding. So to start wrapping up my presentation, I said at the onset that this was an iconic project, or that's the title of my presentation. And it is so because it was not only the origin of maritime archaeology in Argentina, not only an amazing site, not only the fact that local people from Puerto Deseado discovered it, and there's a museum that hosts a collection, and they had this great sense of community by not wanting to sell the artifacts or make personal profit. But there's also an international component of the HMS Swift project. In this image, you can see a photograph taken during one of our international field seasons, where you have from left to right, Chris Underwood from the UK, and of course a reference for NAS, he's worked many years with the NAS. Coralie Sauter from Australia, Marc-André Bernier from Canada, myself from Argentina, the four of us also NAS tutors, plus colleagues from the Netherlands like Martijn Manders, who gave the previous presentation, and people from the US, from Colombia, Chile, Uruguay, Switzerland, and more. So I think that is really great. And then, well, this collection is going back to the people. These are images on the left-hand side of the local museum in Puerto Deseado, which is called Mario Brosowski, in honor of one of the young men who discovered the site and who died at a young age, sadly. And the images on the right show some traveling exhibitions that have been done in Buenos Aires and other parts of Argentina so far, but there could be an international exhibition in the UK or in some other part of the world, why not, about this fabulous 18th century collection. There are, of course, many publications aimed at different public, such as leaflets in the museum, dissemination articles, and more academic articles like one published in the IJNA in 2007. And there is a book that, let's say, compiles all these years of research at the site. It is called The Shipwreck of HMS Swift, 1770, Maritime Archaeology in Patagonia. It's in Spanish only for now. Maybe at some point it can be translated into English or some other language. English would be the obvious first choice. And it has a DVD, which has photographs of the entire collection of artifacts recovered so far, which is about 500 artifacts that, as you could see, are in very, very good condition, and also has some underwater footage. So let's say this is our main publication about HMS Swift. And there have also been some videos, documentaries, and more recently a TV program on HMS Swift. Here in the bottom of the screen, I'm sharing the site where you can watch the documentary and the password. And it's a very interesting documentary because it covers the whole story from Patrick Gower coming to Argentina and Puerto Deseado, and then the local people discovering the site, and then other professionals like ourselves becoming involved, let's say, for the archaeology component. And of course, there's also a conservation component. Now, the conservation is undertaken by the Brosowski Museum. And I want to finish by acknowledging, by recognizing the fantastic work done by people from other disciplines. And these are just the main people who helped in the project throughout the years. You can see they come from a variety of disciplines. And they were really committed to this project. So we're really grateful to them. And these are the main sponsors of the HMS Swift project. And I want to stress that the main sponsors were from Argentina. And I say this because people tend to think that these projects can only be done with a lot of money from the developed world, rich countries, and so on. And it's not necessarily the case. I think the key point is to do the work at the scale that you can deal with. And that's, for example, why we only excavated some parts of the ship. There was no point in us bringing up hundreds of artifacts, which then could not be conserved, or could not be stored, or could not be displayed. So I think that that's a way that you can do archaeology in relation to your resources, human and financial and others. So, like I said, these are some of the main sponsors, but you can see that among the sponsors, there's the British Embassy in Buenos Aires and other organizations. And with that, I finish with this photograph taken some years ago when we were younger, working at this amazing site, which is the HMS Swift, and which is definitely shared heritage with the UK in first place, and also with the world. And if you ever come to Argentina, please go to Puerto Deseado and visit the Mario Brosowski Museum. You will really like the experience. So thank you very much.